So on the subject of funding, yes, you know, the library, we don't pay rent, but we also, you know, get no funds from the library. We are entirely dependent for Dave's salary, Dave, who's absolutely essential, on donations. So if you're inspired, don't hold back. And this year I wanted to start something called Pick Your Own Opera Lecture. If you have a favorite opera that I haven't done, you come and talk to me about it. And then if you're willing to sponsor that lecture, that would be great. And you can call the office, but talk to me about the opera. I mean, if I don't know the opera, I'd be happy to learn about it. Yeah. So that's an idea if I haven't done what you're really anxious to know. Okay? So, anybody coming through that door? Okay, good. So we're going to start because Wagner wrote long operas, you know, so there's a lot of music. But we're going to start in a rather obvious place with Jane Austen, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. In her novel Emma, Mr. Knightley famously said to Emma, "If I loved you less, I could talk about it more." But that wasn't Richard Wagner's problem. He talked about love a lot. And he was very, very fascinated by the subject. So people and poets have been writing about love for millennia. And a lot of hearts have been broken, and a lot of ink has been spilled. And yet, love remains a great motivator and a great mystery. Granted, love is a powerful thing, but can an emotion actually be translated into musical sound? Well, Wagner certainly tried, and with some success, I think you'll see. And this is what we're going to explore today. Can music replicate or hook into a human emotion like love? And I will let you decide. But you'll have some examples to work with. In 1854, Wagner wrote from Zurich to his friend and mentor, the composer Franz Liszt, about a very special, heartfelt idea he had for a new opera. And he said, since in this life, Wagner talking about himself, since in this life I have never experienced the true happiness of love, I want to create a memorial for this most beautiful of all dreams. Actually, it's a little odd that he said that, because one writer called Wagner an extremely amorous man. To name only a few of his flames, there was Jessie Lossot, Minna Planner, who he married, his first wife, Mathilde Wesendonck, Mathilde Meyer, Judith Gauthier Mendes, Blandine Liszt-Olivier, daughter of Franz Liszt, and then his great but not last love, Cosima Liszt von Bülow. So notwithstanding this sort of self-deprecating declaration that he'd never experienced the true happiness of love, he was very susceptible to amorous attractions his whole life, beginning with a self-avowed crush on the singer Wilhelmina Schroeder-Devrient. When he was 16 years old, he heard her sing Fidelio, and he was gone. He was raptured. So he wrote about that a lot, and later in his life he compared the performance of other singers with Wilhelmina Schroeder-Devrient. I'm sure she was, I think, the first Fidelio, the first Leonoran Fidelio. But there were, as you probably know, a lot of Fidelios. Come back at the end of the season, I'm going to let you on. Right. So, at the time of writing to Liszt, He was infatuated with Matilda Wesendonck, who wrote 5 very famous poems that he set to music as sort of studies, preambles to Tristan. And she was the wife of a wealthy Swiss businessman who had provided a place for Wagner to live in exile from Saxony. You know, Wagner was kind of a political guy, and he was involved in an uprising in Dresden, and he got kicked out of Saxony. So for a few years anyway, he was wandering around, and he always managed to find people who would give him a place to live. And, and then he'd fall in love with their wives. Never mind. So, even though the objects of his affections were mostly married, that was never considered an impediment by Wagner. He had a healthy ego and felt his personal needs and his genial talent should have priority. This disregard for the conventions of propriety, as well as the rights and feelings of the affected husbands, stood him in good stead when he fell in love with Cosima von Bülow. Cosima was the daughter of his mentor, Franz Liszt. I'm trying to think, yes, Liszt did have a son, but he had mostly daughters. And Wagner was in love with 2 of them. But Cosima was, I think, his youngest daughter. And she was the wife of Wagner's musical collaborator, the conductor Hans von Bülow. She was already the mother of 2 young children. And as usual, Wagner simply ignored everyone else's needs in favor of his own. Wagner visited Berlin, where Hans von Bülow was employed as a conductor, in 1863. In an excursion, some people say a walk through the park, alone, together, Richard and Cosima confessed their mutual love, and for her anyway, the die was cast. Although he continued to actively recruit other female friends. Cosima and Richard didn't marry right away. They had to wait until her marriage to Hans von Bülow was annulled many, many years later, and by that time they already had 3 children. Isolde was the first, Eva, and Siegfried. In most, and now to today's opera, it is among the most praised and the most reviled operas, sort of rivaling with Salome for being the most praised and the most reviled in music history. The infamous music critic Edvard Hanslick called Wagner's concept of endless melody a musical structure elevated to the level of formlessness. Later, he described it as an opium reverie for which a dedicated temple in Bayreuth has been erected. The great British musicologist Ernest Newman believed that of all Wagner's operas, Tristan was the hardest to understand. But he wasn't talking about the music. He was talking about all the twists and turns in the plot and all the questions that remain unanswered at the end of the opera. You're thinking, what was it? Mark Twain. Actually, you have to put yourself at the end of the 19th century, about 1876, when Bayreuth opened. And musicians and politicians and literary figures from all over Europe pilgrimaged to Bayreuth. And it was considered sort of, what do they call it? Next to the Hajj, the most important religious pilgrimage in the world. So they all went, and many of them wrote about it. And Mark Twain was among the visitors, and he was a great observer of human nature, as you know. He visited in 1891. He was fascinated by the multitudes that came to worship, as he said, at the shrine of Saint Wagner. Nevertheless, he described the rapt audience attention in a performance of Tristan as being, the audience was stirred to their profoundest depths. And there are times when they want to rise and shout their approbation, and other times when tears are running down their faces. You'll remember Alma Schindler-Mahler. I spoke on her a couple of years ago. Gustav Mahler's wife. She is said to have been able to play the entire piano score of Tristan and Isolde by memory. And when she died, she directed that the score, the orchestral score, be buried with her. One wit described the casket as being very heavy. Wagner's achievement in writing Tristan and Isolde seems even more remarkable when you consider that he was in the middle of composing the Ring cycle, and he stopped when he got this idea and started doing Tristan. Once he had Tristan, he thought, well, I'll do Meistersinger while I'm at it. And then after Meistersinger, he resumed his work on the Ring. And think of the immense scale of each of these works. So we're talking 4 or 5 hours for most of them in length. And he was both the librettist, the composer, and the score arranger. So how did he manage to hold all of these musical ideas, which are not always in the same musical language? How did he manage to hold them in his mind virtually at the same time? So let's take a moment to talk about the significance of the compositional style of Tristan and its place in the arc of classical music history. Scholars tell us that not all of Wagner's musical ideas were original with him. Hints of Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet can be heard, as well as threads from a piece that nobody knows by Hans von Bülow. It's a symphonic work called Nirvana. I have never heard it programmed, I've never heard it. But apparently it contains some of the material that Wagner then worked into Tristan and Isolde. Nevertheless, I mean, Shakespeare was derivative too. There are very few Shakespeare plays that were totally the figment of his imagination. They always had source materials. Not always, not invariably, but mostly. But Tristan, in the course of music history, is a watershed moment where music leaves the rather predictable harmonies and melodic structures of previous composers and previous generations and ventures into a realm where personal human emotion is translated into sound. Wagner himself talked about the sensual sound of the orchestra. Max Rudolph, the great conductor, wrote very persuasively about a scrap of melody, which I'll play for you in a second. Perhaps we can call it even a leitmotif. It appears in Act 3 of Tristan in the solo violin, and it reveals, according to Max Rudolph, the ecstasy of love. See if you... And that's not wrong. Okay. I'll do it again. That's what we call dissonance. Variously described also as chromaticism. It depends on where it goes. So according to the setting in the orchestra, Max Rudolph, who was a very famous conductor, thought this perfectly described the ecstasy of love. I don't know. We'll see. So with the following excerpt, our first, we're going to jump ahead a little bit in the chronology, simply because I want you to hear something that illustrates this business of Can music replicate human emotion? This first excerpt is from 1929 with laureates. Melchior, as you can see there, and the Isolde is Frida Leida, who was a very famous German soprano. But the important person here in this excerpt is the conductor, Alfred Coates. He was a Brit, but he was the general music director, if memory serves, of the St. Petersburg Opera Company, St. Petersburg, Russia. And this, of all the love duets that I have heard, this one has just captured my memory as something that really comes close to replicating the feelings, human feelings. So I wanted you to hear a little bit of it, and we have a wonderful collaborator here, Alex. Say hello to Alex. So this happens in Act 2. That's why I said I'm jumping ahead a little bit. When Tristan and Isolde sort of get reckless and very heedless of their own dilemma, and they let their feelings for each other be known. And you can hear it in the orchestra. And the tempo, I must say, is breathlessly exciting and almost unsingable. If I had to sing that, I could hardly keep up. But Leida and Melchior, they do a good job. So, Alex? saying that time is fleeting, so we're going to move on. Do you hear what I meant with that? I mean, it really turns your ears. So, although Wagner reverted to his previous music style when he returned to writing The Ring, Tristan is a different musical language than The Ring of the Nibelungen. The parameters of musical composition were forever expanded with Tristan, and no one could put the genie back in the bottle. Think about it. Without Wagner, could we have had Mahler or Debussy? See, I'm talking about the chromaticism, his use of harmonies and melodies that just sort of went, rather than, that's too four-square for Wagner. He was much more subtle than that. Just as nowadays, all flights, all planes have to go through Atlanta. Back at the end of the 19th century, all composers had to go through Wagner. I mean, love him or hate him, you had to deal with him. I mean, some could reject this new musical language. That's fine. They go their own way, and that's great. But you had to go through that bottleneck. He was the one you had to deal with. And there's a comment by author Barry Millington in that wonderful series of books called The Groves Dictionary of Opera. And this quote, I think, is particularly insightful. Tristan and Isolde is regarded as a milestone in the history of music, largely on account of its pervasive emancipation of dissonance. So before, everything had to be consonant. And after Wagner, dissonance was a whole new world. You could go through dissonance to consonance, but you had to work through it. Very interesting musical, also philosophical concept. But now back to the dramatic impact of Tristan and Isolde. Society in the late 19th century did not approve of public displays of passion. This explains in part some of the dismay or even revulsion expressed by members of first audiences. Again, I cite Salome as another tipping point in programming eroticism on the stage. The great 19th century pianist Clara Schumann, you remember Clara? She was Robert's wife. And she was not famous for her reluctance to criticize her fellow musicians. She said, upon first hearing Tristan, that it was a love lunacy, the most repugnant thing I have ever seen or heard in all my life. In the second act, neither of them does anything other than sleep and sing. So let's remember, in pretty much all forms of drama, from the Greeks to the present day, the rhetorical tools are three things: conflict, tension, and resolution. Conflict, tension, resolution. In music and also in drama. What we had that was new in Tristan was a kind of sensuous yearning in the music that plays a pivotal role, certainly not in the subtleties of the text, but certainly in the music expressed by an abundant use of chromaticism with unresolved harmonies. So, I'm trying to think of a phrase I could play for you that says, a phrase that ends but doesn't resolve. So you're left with something like this. There's no... Right? That's the resolution. So, and you know, that does create tension, doesn't it? Oh, please resolve that chord. So chromatics create this sort of palpable conflict and tension, and Wagner left it unfulfilled. Or he delayed it, or diverted it into other musical gestures. So we're going to start with an explanation of what is called the Tristan chord. And the person who's going to explain it to us is Antonio Papano, who was music director of Covent Garden. And he can do it much better than I can. And then after he explains it, we'll listen to it actually in the orchestral version. Okay?
Now, you've probably heard talk mention the Tristan chord that Wagner didn't invent. Chopin used it, Beethoven used it, Bach used it, but it's what Wagner does with this chord. The chord itself is this, which, when you listen to it, creates, there's a certain, there's almost a letting out of air when that chord hits. It's the depression. But what's important about that chord, which, I mean, I can talk to you about French sixth and subdominant and dominant. None of that's, for tonight, none of that's relevant. What's important to know is that it's introduced by a figure that is, it's a big skip, which creates, it's so long and finally resolves to something that is ambiguous. It's not an arrival, it's something that makes you feel a little bit off balance. It then resolves to something equally hanging in the air. Now, what I mean by that is the melody in itself, an extra bit of melody comes in on the oboe, and that resolves. That resolves. But the chords underneath it depress and don't resolve and suggest a key, maybe that, but no. I'll play it again. This is also the importance of this chord, the silence after it, which seems an eternity. That's what I call modern music. In the silences are the secrets. The same pattern. He repeats this, and all of a sudden you have the same pattern, but he goes up to another key, implying another key. Again, silence. It's done a little bit shorter. And this time, instead of just going, it goes further. Syncopations, more pain, this time with an accent. He won't resolve this chord, he won't resolve it, because he's... Wagner's genius is that he wants the music never to resolve. The love is never ending. The pain is never ending. There is no resolution. The only resolution comes at the very end of the opera, finally. And I'll play that. You hear finally the theme for the last time. And listen. Ah, that's 4.5 hours later. But it's true. That's the journey to that chord.
Was that helpful? Yeah. Right. Okay, it's quiz time. No, but before we get to quiz time, just one more comment. In this opera, not a lot happens. It's sort of like Trovatore, il Trovatore, where nothing happens on stage. It must happen in the intermissions because they come back and talk about it. And that's a little bit like Tristan and Isolde. They talk about action, but not a lot happens. Although at the end of the second act, Tristan is wounded, and in the third act, his wound is infected and he's about to die. So a little bit of action, not a whole lot for the number of hours that you're sitting there. Anyway, quiz time. So this is a complete this phrase, please. How many know the great Wagnerian soprano Astrid Varney? Yeah, good. I sang with her a number of times. She's an interesting person. She was born in Sweden, grew up in America, had American citizenship. Yeah, it's a complicated story. Anyway, Astrid famously said, the most important thing as a singer that you need to have or do when singing Wagner is complete the phrase. Sorry?
Comfortable shoes.
How did you know that?
Comfortable shoes.
Comfortable shoes. Not don't sing too loudly or don't practice 12 hours before or eat a steak. None of that. She said the most important thing you need when singing Wagner is comfortable shoes. Because you're going to be standing for a long time. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Okay. So moving right along. In Tristan, as in other Wagner operas, the text elaborates at great length on the backstory. He loved the backstory. So, as you know, Wagner drew from various legends, and this is no exception. He consolidated them and shaped them into a story for his own purposes. When the opera begins, we find Isolde, together with her handmaiden, Brangäne, on their way to Cornwall from Ireland on a ship captained by Tristan. The backstory is on the handout. There, when they reach Cornwall, Isolde is going to become the wife of King Mark. Marke, if you say it in German. Brangäne and Isolde discuss this dilemma at great length because Brangäne knows that Tristan and Isolde are in love. But Ireland had conquered Cornwall, and that meant that Cornwall had to pay tribute to Ireland, and I guess, getting an Irish bride was a part of the tribute. So that's quite a dilemma when you're not in love with the man you're going to marry. And Isolde is feeling betrayed because Tristan came to Ireland and fetched her. So she asked Brangäne to invite Tristan to join them in her compartment on the ship and to prepare a very special potion from her mother's medicine chest with which to greet Tristan. Isolde calls that potion reconciliation. Sühne in German, Sühne. Reconciliation, but of course, that's just the name she's applied it. She's sort of, giving Brangäne a wink, saying that, that special drink, she means the drink of death. So, Brangäne invites Tristan, and we are going to watch his entrance in this next clip. The interesting thing about this clip is it may be the only video of Birgit Nilsson excuse me, and Wolfgang Wintergassen singing this opera together. I actually heard it in Bayreuth back in the day. Yes, question? Brangena is Isolde's handmaiden, her servant. Yeah. But they're kind of friends. They talk things over at length. So she's Brangena's invited Tristan and prepared the drink. Isolde thinks it's the drink of death, and Tristan, of course, feeling guilt about this whole thing, probably thinks that as well. So let's see what happens when Tristan arrives and they share this drink. And this is a 14-minute excerpt, but I'm going to cut it off. So, I will cut it off at some point, okay? Sorry? That's it. But that's as high as the volume goes when you give a master. They'll get cranked up in a minute. This is actually was recorded in Japan. us drink reconciliation. So Brangega will bring her the goblet. I'd love to keep playing that. What happens is she gets the goblet, she brings it to him, and she drinks from it, he drinks from it. They look at each other and fall into each other's arms. But with Wagner, it takes too long to do that. We don't have that much time. Okay. But anyway, you have a little sense. I mean, she was complaining to him about how he treated her, and then she finally says, "Lass uns sühnen trinken." Let us drink to reconciliation. Yeah. Okay.
Next time you present this, we're going to want to see your subtitles next.
Yeah,
I just asked him, but he can't add them.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes they're in the video embedded, and you're just a matter of activating that. But this, I'm sorry, this is an old video. But I thought you'd want to hear Nielsen as well as
I'm teasing.
Oh, you're teasing me again. He does that all the time. Okay, so let's recap what has happened in the story up till now. We have, in the backstory, Tristan killed Moro, who was Isolde's fiancé. Then he gets wounded in that fight, and he assumes the name of Tantris and travels to Ireland, they talked about that, to recover from a wound that was sustained that only Isolde can heal. So it was her poison that wounded him, so only she can heal. And then, actually, what happens is they discover a splinter that belonged to Morol's sword, and so she realizes that Tristan was the one who killed Morol. And she lifts her sword or his, whatever, in order to kill Tristan, and at that moment he looks at her, and she can't do it. And and Wagner says it very beautifully in "Sie lässt es fallen." She lets the sword fall. She's not able to kill him and exact revenge. So they drink this. It's supposed to be the drink of death, but actually it just releases all their inhibitions. They fall into each other's arms, and it's great, So, and they both forget their obligations to King Mark, and it's even more powerful in the upcoming scene. So now we talk about the power of love. Obviously, Wagner was not the only composer to try to bring love onto the stage in its various forms. Love has lots of forms in the operatic stage. Generally speaking, and I think this is important, this is the last page. I think this is important. Generally speaking, composers, and I suppose dramatists as well, deal with the kind of love, particularly opera composers, that deal with the kind of love that overcomes obstacles, and then both parties live happily ever after, right? Don't we know that? Huge obstacles, and then something resolves, and they live happily ever after. That's not what we're talking about here. One example of that traditional kind of ending is the final scene from The Magic Flute. You remember The Magic Flute? The famous fire and water scene at the end. So that's the symbolic purification that enables the two lovers, in the case of the Magic Flute, Tamino and Pamina, to be united, right? Wagner used the power of love, and that's the happily ever after thing. Wagner used the power of love in a larger philosophical context. The redemptive power of love that requires ultimate sacrifice. Which, of course, gives the composer an excuse for a beautiful musical apotheosis, big thrilling scene at the end. That's called redemptive love, because it requires sacrifice. So when you think about it, the Liebestod, which means love death, at the end of Tristan, is similar to the immolation scene at the end of Götterdämmerung. In both scenes, after extended conflict and tension in the story, Wagner hands the final summation over to the leading female character. In Götterdämmerung, Brünnhilde, does anybody here come to my lecture on the ring? Whoa, one. You did, didn't you? Never mind. Anyway, Götterdämmerung, at the end, Brünnhilde has 15 minutes where she's setting fire to the world. Yeah, that's the summing up of all of this conflict and tension. She's standing, Brünnhilde is standing on the banks of the Rhine. I'm a phlegm factory. Standing on the banks of the Rhine over the body of her murdered husband Siegfried, right? And she tells everybody that the only way to expunge the deceit and the conflict and the selfishness that brought the gods to this point, to this low point, is to return the ring to its original owners, who were the Rhine maidens. And then, here comes the sacrifice, and then forfeit her own life in the flames that consume her husband's body. The Rhine overflows its banks, the Rhine maidens claim the ring, and the world is saved, sort of thing. I find beginnings are easy in life. Endings are always difficult. Wagner famously wrote 5 different endings for Götterdämmerung. There are reasons for that, but we don't have time to talk about it another time. It's about Schopenhauer. In Tristan, of course, there is no purifying water and fire, as in Götterdämmerung or the Magic Flute. The final message is simply redemption brought about by love and sacrifice. So, as Tristan, before I say the last sentence, I want to thank Dr. Walter J. Is he here today? Oh, I look for him. He's the one who suggested I do this lecture, and so I am very grateful to him for suggesting that. As Tristan lies dying, we're now going to listen to the Liebestod, which is a very famous ending to Tristan. And I will tell you it's 10 minutes long, so if you have an urgent need to leave, you're certainly welcome to do that. But I didn't want to withhold that experience of listening to the Liebestod. And the singer is Waltraud Meyer, okay?